I was gay, but in the war in 1964 I had to pretend to be someone else just to stay alive. Not because the enemy would spot it, not because it changed how I held a rifle, but because the men beside me, my own side, could decide you weren't one of us. And in that world, being different could get you destroyed in ways nobody would write down. Stay with me, because this isn't just a war story. It's a story about fear that doesn't come from the battlefield, about the masks people wear when the cost of honesty is too high, and about the one moment in 1964 that forced a choice. Keep pretending forever, or risk losing everything in a single breath. Before we jump in, quick favor that genuinely helps keep this channel alive. Subscribe, hit like, and drop a comment. It matters a lot more than people think, and it keeps these stories coming. All right, no fluff. Let's go. When people talk about war, they usually talk about courage like it's one thing. Like courage is always loud. Like it's always charging forward, always heroic, always clean. But the war in 1964 introduced me to a quieter kind of courage, the kind that looks like nothing from the outside, the kind that happens inside your chest every day in the space between what you are and what you're allowed to be. I grew up in a time when you learned early what not to say. You could feel the invisible rules before you could explain them. Boys were taught what a real man was supposed to look like, sound like, want, and never question. Nobody sat you down and said, "Here are the boundaries." You learned them by watching what happened to the people who crossed them. So I learned the trick of becoming unremarkable. I learned to control my face. I learned how to laugh at the right time, how to look away at the right time, how to lower my voice just enough, how to keep my hands still. I learned that the safest version of yourself is the one nobody notices. Then 1964 arrived, and with it came a new kind of pressure. You're not just expected to fit in, you're expected to prove you belong. You're expected to become part of a machine that doesn't have patience for nuance. War compresses people. It makes everything sharper. It magnifies whatever a group thinks is normal, and it punishes whatever falls outside that shape. Training was its own world. You wake up before you're fully awake. You move when you're told. You speak when you're spoken to. You learn the rhythm of commands and the habit of not asking questions. In that environment, there's a kind of unofficial curriculum running alongside the official one. The official lesson is about discipline and survival. The unofficial lesson is about dominance, who gets to be safe, who gets to be targeted, who gets to be the joke. And that's where I understood something terrifying. I wasn't just hiding from strangers. I was hiding in plain sight from the people who were supposed to have my back. Because in 1964, the label gay didn't land as a personal detail. It landed like a verdict, like a permission slip for cruelty, like a reason for someone to decide you deserved whatever happened next. So yes, I was gay, but in the war in 1964, I lived like a man acting in a play where the stage never closes. I watched what the others watched. I made my jokes match theirs. I kept my reactions small. I became fluent in a language I hated speaking, the language of camouflage. And the exhausting part wasn't only the pretending, it was the constant calculation. You start thinking in angles and shadows. You start predicting people's moods. You start asking yourself questions that feel absurd in any normal life. Did I smile too softly? Did I hesitate too long? Did I look at him the wrong way? Did my voice change when I got tired? That's when you realize how fear works. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers all day. In my unit, masculinity wasn't just an identity. It was a currency. Guys traded it like proof. They tried to outdo each other with toughness, with stories, with swagger, with cruelty disguised as humor. It wasn't everyone, but it only takes a few loud men to set the climate for everyone else. And there was one lieutenant who was especially good at turning people into targets. He didn't need proof. He didn't need facts. He just needed a suspicion and an audience. He'd throw comments like knives, then watch to see who flinched. He had a favorite trick. He'd say something humiliating in a half-joking tone and wait to see if you laughed. If you didn't laugh, he'd act like you were the problem. If you did laugh, he'd act like you agreed. Either way, you lost. I learned to laugh at jokes that made my stomach turn. I learned to perform indifference with the precision of an actor who knows the critics can ruin his life. But pretending doesn't make you safe forever. It just buys you time. The war in 1964 was expanding. The news spoke in cautious phrases, the kind meant to sound controlled: advisors, assistants, escalation. But the men being trained could feel the direction. We could feel the weight being loaded onto our lives. And there was another pressure too, a private one, a pressure that had nothing to do with politics. When you're trapped in a rigid environment, you don't stop being human. You don't stop noticing beauty. You don't stop craving kindness. If anything, the hunger gets worse because you're starving for something normal. That's what made it dangerous, because the smallest moment of softness could be misread. A pause, a glance, a kindness offered to the wrong person. War turns tiny details into accusations. So I trained myself to become hard on the outside. Not cruel, not loud, just sealed. The problem is, when you seal yourself long enough, you start forgetting what you sealed in there. I remember one night in particular, no dramatic explosions, no movie scene, just a night where exhaustion made everyone roar. People were talking in that loose, half-serious way they talk when the day is finally over. Someone asked about home. Someone asked about what you'd do when you got back. The conversation drifted into the usual territory. Girls, marriage, the kinds of futures people were expected to want. A guy across from me said, smiling like it was nothing, "You better not come back weird." The others laughed. Not all of them, but enough. He said it again, this time louder, as if he was doing me a favor. "Just don't be one of those." The thing about a comment like that is it forces you to choose instantly. You can try to ignore it, but ignoring can look like guilt. You can react, but reacting can look like confirmation. You can joke, but joking can trap you. It's a psychological no-win. So I did what I'd been doing for months. I played the role. I gave a casual smile, a shrug, a line that sounded normal enough to end the moment. And the conversation moved on. But inside something cracked, because it wasn't just fear anymore. It was grief. Grief for the version of me that might have lived openly if the world weren't built like a cage. Grief for the idea that I was fighting in a war for freedom while having to surrender my own. That's the irony that haunts people like me. You can wear the uniform, follow every rule, risk everything, and still be treated like you're disposable. In 1964, people loved simple stories. Good guys, bad guys, strong, weak, normal, abnormal. Those categories made people feel safe. But human beings don't fit into neat boxes, especially not under pressure. The more I pretended, the more I noticed how fragile the whole system was, how much of it was theater. The loudest guys weren't always the bravest. The toughest talkers weren't always steady when things got real. A lot of the cruelty was a mask too, just a different kind. Men terrified of being seen as vulnerable learned to punish vulnerability in others. Montaigne said something like, "We often fear suffering more than we suffer." But in my case, the fear was a daily suffering. A constant small pain, not because I was ashamed of who I was, but because I had to treat my truth like contraband. Then came the moment that changed everything. It wasn't a grand moment. It was a quiet, ugly one. A rumor started. It always starts like that. Not with a fact, with a vibe, with someone saying, "You ever notice?" With laughter that pretends it's innocent. With a glance, a whisper, a little performance of suspicion. And once a rumor has a shape, people start fitting details into it. A polite guy becomes suspicious. A quiet guy becomes hiding something. A man who doesn't brag becomes not normal. I felt it before anyone said it straight to me. The atmosphere around me changed. Conversations stopped when I walked in. Jokes became sharper, like they were being tested on my skin. People watched my reaction the way predators watch movement. The lieutenant noticed too, and he leaned into it. He called me out in front of others. Not with a direct accusation at first, but with that controlled cruelty that's designed to make you panic. He said my name slowly. He asked questions that weren't really questions. "You got a girl back home? You ever been with a girl? Why you so quiet?" The room went silent in that particular way where silence becomes a weapon. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Not because I was guilty of anything wrong, but because the rules of the room were wrong, and those rules had power. In that moment, I realized something. I could spend my entire life proving I was normal to people who would never be satisfied. You can't win respect from someone committed to misunderstanding you. So I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I told the truth in the only way I safely could. Not about my identity, not in a way that gave them something to use, but about the principle. I said evenly, "Sir, my personal life doesn't change my ability to do my job." The lieutenant smiled, like he'd caught something. He stepped closer and said, "In war, everything matters." And that line was the whole sickness, right there. When people want power over you, they make your private self into public property. They claim the right to define you. But here's the part nobody expects. The general was there. Not physically in the room at that second, but on base, and a complaint had already been lodged. Quietly, through channels most men never used because they assumed it was useless. Someone, a person you wouldn't have guessed, had noticed what was happening. Someone had decided the lieutenant's behavior wasn't discipline, it was harassment. And in a military system, there are lines you don't cross when you get too confident. A day later, I was called in. Not to be punished, not to be humiliated, but to be questioned by someone who didn't enjoy the sound of his own authority. A higher officer asked what had happened, calmly. He didn't ask for gossip. He asked for facts. And here is where the story takes its turn. I expected the worst. I expected that telling the truth about the lieutenant's behavior would backfire. I expected that I'd be labeled problem for speaking up at all. But instead, I saw something that felt almost unreal in 1964. Professionalism. The officer didn't make it about identity. He made it about conduct. He said, "No one here gets to run their mouth in a way that damages unit cohesion." It was the first time I heard the phrase unit cohesion used to protect someone like me, not to erase someone like me. And the lieutenant, he didn't get a dramatic public downfall. Real life rarely gives you that satisfaction. But the behavior stopped. The leash tightened. The room changed. And that's when I learned the most unexpected lesson of the war in 1964. Sometimes the way you survive isn't by becoming invisible. Sometimes it's by becoming steady. Not loud, not reckless, steady. Because steadiness is hard to attack. Steadiness doesn't feed the predator. Steadiness doesn't beg for permission to exist. Did everything suddenly become safe? No. It was still 1964. The culture didn't transform overnight. I still had to be careful. I still had to choose what I shared and what I kept. But something in me shifted. The pretending stopped being my identity. It became just a strategy for a hostile environment, not a verdict on my worth. And that's the deeper truth behind the title. I was gay, but I had to pretend so I wouldn't be killed in the war in 1964. The pretending wasn't about shame. It was about survival. It was about being forced to live under other people's fear. But the unexpected ending is this: the war didn't erase me. It tried. The environment tried. The jokes, the rumors, the rules, the silence, they all tried to compress me into a shape that would be acceptable. But something stubborn in me refused. I learned that your identity is not something the crowd gets to vote on. Years later, when people asked what I remembered most, they expected the usual answers: noise, terror, adrenaline. What I remembered most was the quiet cost of hiding. The way it makes you split into parts. The way it teaches you to mistrust your own instincts. The way it steals the simplest human thing, the freedom to be ordinary. And yet, I also remembered the moments of decency. The moments when one person chose not to participate. The moments when professionalism beat cruelty. The moments when I realized the world is never one thing. Even in 1964. Even in war. Even in places where the rules are harsh, there are people who quietly refuse to be cruel. That's not a fairy tale. It doesn't solve everything. But it matters. Because if you're looking for hope, hope is often smaller than you want it to be. It's often just one decision by one person to not join the mob. Now I want to ask you something, and I want a real answer in the comments. Do you think not caring means emotional numbness? Or does it mean refusing to let other people's fear define your life? And if you've ever felt like you had to hide a part of yourself to survive a room, what helped you get through it? If this story made you think, subscribe, hit like, and leave a comment. It helps keep the paradox garden alive, and it helps more people find stories that don't just entertain, but actually leave you with something.